welcome to Such a Nightmare, Conversations about Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and joining me is Anthony Tresca.
Hello.
This is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are excited and thankful for you all to be joining us for our discussion of 1973's The Exorcist.
As we gently cautioned people at the end of our previous episode, Anthony and I are not going to...
This is not going to be one of those where we're, searching for bad things to say about it and just gushing over it the whole time.
Yes. In fact, we're going to be working really hard to avoid doing the opposite, because one of the most important things to us is that we don't ever want there to be an episode where it just feels like a bash session, because that's not...
Yeah, we don't want to vomit all over any film like Reagan vomits over all of the people in this film.
At first I thought you meant the president, and I didn't know where you were going to go with the Reagan and vomit, and I was like, I'm not familiar, and then...
Yeah, you haven't heard of Ronald Reagan's vomit scandal?
Yeah, I was like, I don't think...
Yeah, he vomited all over the Russian leader at the time.
That's honestly, I was like, I'm not...
Weirdest power play of all time.
Well, it kind of is in this film. But yes, we're going to avoid the vomiting, and the trauma of The Exorcist in our discussion. But quite frankly and quite honestly, dear listeners, we just want to brace you for the fact that we're not going to be in total praise of this film. And there's really good reasons for it, right? So normally we begin with our framework, and then we kind of go into the stuff, but maybe we should kind of begin with just beginning with our why in a sentence or two this film didn't do the things for us that we hoped it would do, and then go into the framework. There's no need to keep people in suspense.
So I obviously heard about The Exorcist for a while, but I actually didn't watch it until extremely recently. It was one of the horror films. I had seen a bunch of the classics in quotation marks, but I hadn't gotten around to The Exorcist. I just assumed I'd get there one day. It was one of those. We both come from religious backgrounds, and I'm Catholic. I was raised Catholic, so The Exorcist is very much talked about in Catholicism. Obviously, if you've seen the film, you know why.
Right.
It's very much talked about and held you don't want to watch that movie. It's the scariest thing ever.
Right.
And then when I watched it, I was extremely disappointed at what both was and wasn't there.
Yes. So as somebody who, I remember very distinctly when I was in high school, I bought the box set of the Anne Rice vampire books, and my mom was like, I'm so disappointed in you. And so I got rid of them, and now I'm like, why did I do that? But there was just kind of always this understanding that, this is not an ideal thing for one to be interested in, but if you're going to be interested in it, you kind of need to stay clear of the super, quote, dangerous ones, right? Spiritually dangerous, and so The Exorcist was on the list. It was the same thing for me. I didn't see it, even as a horror scholar. I kept pushing it off. I knew every scene. I could tell you all about it. I just couldn't make myself watch it because it felt like a betrayal of everything that I was before, right? As well as still that sort of, but what if, right? What if I watch this film and then creepy things start happening to my house? Did I bring it to myself? So I think this is one of those films, and it's so ironic, but the problem is that the film can't live up to the hype, right?
Yeah.
No film can live up to the hype.
Just decades
yes.
of praise, and it's, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, later on, just its influence is pretty much everywhere in the horror genre, or at least the modern horror genre after the 70s. So it's just impossible to get away from it.
Yes.
And, you said you knew every scene. Of course,
right.
It's just so ingrained in the cultural zeitgeist at this point.
Absolutely. And so that's, going to be the start of our complaints or criticisms of the film, and we'll come back to this because it's not just this that the hype isn't good enough, right? Is that there are some fundamental flaws that we find with the form and content of the film as well.
Indeed.
And so we'll get to that in a second, but I want to set up our critical framework because it's going to lead me to discuss one of my issues with the film. So today I want to talk about, there's a very great book called Hearths of Darkness instead of Hearts of Darkness. Very punny.
Very punny.
The
Did
family,
I write this book?
I know. I knew I had to buy it when I saw that there was going to be a pun as the title. And it's The Family in the American Horror Film by Tony Williams. And this is a popular enough book that of scholarship that it has an updated edition. And so in a book on the family in the American horror film, unsurprisingly, The Exorcist features sort of throughout, like it's sprinkled throughout, and then there's actually like several pages just kind of devoted to it. And I agree entirely with what Williams says in his analysis of The Exorcist. Where I have problem is actually that I don't think that this is what makes the film the most interesting. But, you know, he talks about the fact that, and this is just kind of a quote, The Exorcist appeared at a time of fundamental changes within the family. Despite its enshrinement within American ideology, the unit bore little relationship to ideological representations, increasing divorce rates, one-parent families, developing minority relationships, and economic necessities resulting in two breadwinners, questioned the role of 1950s TV model families like the Cleavers and the Rileys. And then he goes on and says, that beneath the Exorcist's supernatural veil are family tensions. And he talks about gender identity, and he talks about how that fits with the sort of male or masculine demonic presence. He, you know, goes through and talks about, you know, how this is a text that, again, I think is very clearly so, looking at whether or not some of the concerns that we have about the family can be as horrific as a daughter being possessed. And I think the film says that we should be as concerned in many ways with the possession of a child and the potential dissolution of a family unit that sort of mirrors that traditional or ideal family.
Yeah.
And he ends his section specifically on the Exorcist by saying, again, this is a quote, "The families in The Exorcist live in a deteriorating America that no longer offers any coherent solutions to individual family dilemmas. Despite the prologue's desperate attempt to externalize evil, dissonant forces are definitely within the family. The Exorcist visually associates both families before Chris and Damien meet." And then the last sort of couple of sentences are, "Significant dualities occur between institutionally acceptable discourses of patriarchal control and demonic counterparts. Both seek physical control of the female body. The Exorcist's world reveals the family as the real threat, not the imaginary Iraq of the prologue." And so there is some, like, push against, like, it's not just solely a conservative reading, right, that he's offering here. He's saying that, you know, in this family that is not your traditional image, we are still being controlled by these patriarchal forces of religion and of what the, quote, family should look like, and that maybe that is as threatening as is the demonic presence.
Possession.
So Williams doesn't make this entirely a conservative reading, but I still think and we'll get back to it in a minute, one of my fundamental issues with this film is that I think the most interesting parts are the parts that have nothing to do with the family.
Yeah. I think going to be an interesting reading of the film. I agree with most of what Williams says, I think, though. It's like an interesting way to, like, spin a film that has some problems when it comes to its representation of women and just people in general. And it's an interesting way to read it as, like, a commentary. I don't know if it is, as we'll get into, based on, like, the people who are involved in it.
Right.
And what their clear values were.
Right.
As well as, we'll just get into it.
Yeah.
Let's just get into it.
Yeah, I was going to say,
why don't we?
Like, instead of just telling us it, we'll get into it, let's do it.
So, The Exorcist, made in 1973, was directed by William Friedkin and was produced and written for the screen by William Peter Blatty, who wrote the 1971 novel of the same name, The Exorcist. So, Blatty was born January 7th, 1928 in New York City. He was the fifth and youngest child of Lebanese immigrants. His mother, Mary, which is a funny name for a devout Catholic, like she was.
Pretty fitting.
That was his mom. She was also the niece of a bishop, so just very ingrained in this, like, religion growing up. His parents actually separated when he was a toddler, though, which big no-no for Catholics.
Yes.
And he was raised in what he described as comfortable destitution, which is a fun word for poverty, as he would describe it. In the late 1950s, Blatty worked as a public relations director at the University of LA, and then a publicity director for the University of Southern California. And while he was working in California, he published his first book, Which Way to Mecca, Jack, in 1960, which was a humorous look at both his early life and his work. And then in 1961, he got his big break while still working in public relations when he appeared as a contestant on the Groucho Marx quiz show, You Bet Your Life, and he won $10,000, which was enough money to quit his job and write full-time. And then after that, because of how much money he won, he never worked a full-time job in his life.
Excellent.
Although, anyone who you talk to about writing will tell you writing's a full-time job.
A non-clock-in 9-to-5 full-time job. Yes.
Exactly. So after he won all that money, he took a little bit of a break from writing fiction writing, and then he came back and he wrote a little book called The Exorcist.
Oh, interesting. I've never heard of that.
Yeah.
What could it possibly be about?
Well, I'll tell you. His fictional novel was inspired by the 1949 exorcism performed on an anonymous young boy known as Roland Doe. So it's another text that's based on, inspired by true events type of thing.
Put quote marks around that as you listen to it.
Mm-hmm. So Blatty was deeply religious, as he was raised in a deeply religious family, and he spoke of how much religion impacted the writing of this book. A devout Roman Catholic who is very much for the upholding of very traditional family values. He actually campaigned pretty hardly at university settings and all of these places for very, very conservative family values, which is just a thing about him, which probably shapes some of the themes in his texts.
It never occurs to me to do much in the way and looking into the author in the background, just because that's not what usually interests me the most. But one of the things I always find really interesting is this, what are the things that haunted these writers? Not the question of what is wrong with you that you write horror. That is not the question I find interesting. I think that's a silly question. But what are the things that haunt you that you have to keep working out in your own stories? And you can see, they're very clearly, we were talking about Haunting of Hill House the other day, and the things that are haunting Shirley Jackson that are so clearly in that novel. Obviously, you can see the things that haunt Stephen King. And so it's just interesting to be reminded that, Blatty isn't writing this book, presumably, because he's like, ooh, let's terrify people. It's, this terrifies me. Let's dig deeper.
I mean, ideally, true horror comes from what truly does terrify you.
Yes, it should, because it's only going to feel authentic if it, in some way, makes you afraid.
If you're just let's write this to horrify.
Right.
Not because it actually does horrify you. Right. It's probably not going to be very authentic.
No.
And it's clearly these issues of faith, family, clearly keep Blatty up at night.
Yes.
Did. So his book actually topped the New York Times bestseller list when it came out for 17 weeks, remained on that list for 57 weeks, sold more than 13 million copies in the U.S., and was translated into over a dozen languages.
I'd be okay with that degree of success.
Yeah, I think I would too.
Yeah, it'd be a hardship. I'd handle it. I think I'd handle it really gracefully.
Me too. Yeah. I think if someone just wanted to help me stumble into that success, I would bear it with a heavy heart. I would do it.
Yeah, but I mean, this is really impressive to have a horror book, any horror book, but certainly one that's not from the established authors stay on
the list for
that.
so long. Yeah, but we're not here to talk about the book,
we're not.
Are we? We're here to talk about the film. So, although this book had been extremely popular and had been a bestseller, as you just heard, Blatty, who produced, and Friedkin, who was his director and did go on to direct it, had a really difficult job actually casting this film. Because after either they turning down people who the studio presented to them, or being turned down by people who they wanted, by the major stars who they were like, you'd be perfect for this movie, and they were like, no, not going to take on the Catholic Church, we're not going to deal in these issues. They didn't want to do any of that. So they ended up casting the lead roles with relatively unknown actors at the time. I mean, Miller, who played Father Damien, wasn't even an actor. He was the author of a play who had never done film acting before. And this was his big break.
Wow.
So all of these casting choices that the pair proposed were vigorously opposed by the studio executives at Warner Brothers Pictures. However, because Warner Brothers wasn't able to attract any stars to replace them, they eventually just were like, you know what, whatever, fine. Can't get anyone due to how sensitive this content matter is, we'll just do it, fine.
Mm-hmm.
And then principal photography was also difficult because most of the set burned down. Blair, who was the actress playing Regan, and Ellen, who played the mother, suffered long-term injuries because of it, and ultimately the film took twice as long to shoot as scheduled and cost more than twice its budget.
And that is one of the things that, like, even if you haven't seen the film, you've probably heard the almost like to urban legend proportions about the, like, just how hard the production was. You know, there's always rumors, like, every so often they'll be like, Linda Blair died horrifically traumatized by and you're like, no, she didn't, right? Like, there's just, it actually reminds me very much of, like, the expeditions to ancient Egypt where they would come back with a mummy's curse.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there's just, like, well, of course you have this, like, terrible thing because you took on the devil. And so that's part of the, like, mythology of this film.
Oh, hold on to the mythology of this film.
Yes.
Because the release of this film and its reception has been similarly just, like, mythologized?
Mythologized? Yes. I think
that's a word.
It is today.
So its release was on December 26th, 1973. That's right the day after Christmas. Decided to release it.
Oh, yeah.
That's wild. I hadn't made that connection until right now.
I love the fact that we have so many horror movies that come out at Christmas and that come out at Valentine's Day. I just feel it's so
Me too.
appropriate. But yeah, so it doesn't come out on Christmas because that's pushing it even a little. But, like, yeah, the day after Christmas, still the holiday season. This seems like a good time to do it.
And so since it was a horror film that had gone really over budget and didn't have any stars in the lead, Warner Brothers had zero expectations for this film. Didn't preview it for critics, only booked its initial release in 30 screens and on 30 screens in 24 theaters, mostly large cities, and it grossed $1.9 million in the first week, which set house records in each of these theaters. So this type of release is not common for big studio films. It's very common for, like, exploitation films of this period to roll out in smaller theaters, see what hits, and then roll out from there. But this is not how a major studio does it.
No.
So the huge crowds have forced the studio to expand it into wide release extremely quickly, something which they talk about how they weren't quite prepared to do. It was the highest grossing film of that year and Warner Brothers' highest grossing film of all time. After several reissues, the film grossed $232.6 million in the US and Canada, which, adjusted for inflation, makes it the 15th highest grossing film of all time and the top grossing R-rated film of all time. Adjusted to 2019 numbers, The Exorcist has grossed $1.9 billion, which is a lot of money.
Yes, it is. Especially, again, considering
how little faith they had in it.
Yes.
So they also had little faith in it because when it did premiere to critics, it was very mixed reactions. Some thought it was like, okay, and some people thought it was the best thing they'd ever seen. However, despite the mixed reactions and the controversy that surrounded the film due to its content matter, people really came out to see it. In New York, where it had its initial run, patrons were enduring cold weather as severe as 6 degrees, sometimes with rain, sleet, and waited in hours in long lines. The crowds outside the theater sometimes rioted, and police were called to quell disturbances in New York and Kansas City.
Wow.
There were reports of strong audience reactions while watching the film, many accounts of nausea, fainting. A woman in New York was said to have miscarried during a showing of The Exorcist. A reviewer at the time noted that there was so much vomit in the bathroom at the showing he attended that it was impossible to reach the sinks, and some theaters even arranged for ambulances to be on call to help patrons leave the theater due to how traumatized they were by the film.
And again, even if some of these things are true, you know, I'm sure they were not waiting in, like, that much vomit. I just can't imagine. But maybe they were, I don't know. But again, we go back to, this is the mythology that has been produced around the film, and as two people who were most decidedly not alive in the 70s.
Correct.
And who, you know, weren't even doing things in the 80s that mattered, right? Like, this is the world that we've grown up in, right? Mm-hmm. We've grown up in a post-Exorcist world and the mythology of the film,
exactly.
Right? Not just the film itself.
So film historian William Paul actually hits on something very similar, saying that the audience reaction had become a spectacle equal to the film. And he actually makes the claim that he doesn't think any other film's audience has received as much coverage as The Exorcist did.
Interesting.
Which allowed it to, like, build up this.
I remember when Blair Witch Project came out that there was a sort of similar, and they did that on purpose, right? Because they had this whole, like, this is really real. And I remember hearing that, like, they had to hand out, like airplane sickness bags.
Vomit bags.
Mm-hmm. And so, like, but again, I still don't think it matches the release of things like this. I think Psycho was able to also have a similar sort of creation because Hitchcock was able to buy every copy of the book that he could find beforehand so that no one could read it and no one could be surprised, or everyone had to be surprised by the initial death, there at the beginning. And so I think that this is one of the things that's unfortunate about the day and age in which we live in, that it's harder to build that sort of myth about a release of something because you can't control the elements as well, in a way that you just can, right? We can say this is only going to show in 30 cities and there's no way you're really going to be able to see it otherwise, right? Like that's not an option in our world today. So I don't know if he's correct that no other film's audience has been written about or received as much, sort of attention, but it is certainly, the audience response is as much a part of the film as is the film itself. Yeah. And
the most important thing about The Exorcist, in my opinion, probably is the legitimization that it brought horror. A horror magazine wrote a retrospective on this film and said The Exorcist has done for horror films what 2001 did for science fiction. It legitimized it in the eyes of thousands who had previously considered horror movies nothing more than a giggle. Paved the way for big studios gambling on horror, and was one of the first horror franchises from a major studio that had sequels and paved the way for franchising. Excluding, obviously, the films from the 30s, like the monster films, because that was a separate entity in itself.
Yes.
The film was the first horror film nominated for Academy Awards. It was nominated for 10, including Picture, Actress, Supporting Actor, Supporting Actress, Director, Cinematography, Film Editing, Production Design, and actually won 2 Academy Awards for Adapted Screenplay and Sound Mixing. And in 2010, the Library of Congress preserved it.
Yay. So, again, I think it depends on whether or not you're willing to count Psycho as a horror film, as some people are. I've always been kind of on the fence of doing it. But you're right that I don't think films like Get Out or Parasite would have had the same chance if we hadn't, to win the awards that they did, if we hadn't had The Exorcist to pave the way, and to show us that, horror can be, quote, highbrow. And what is the, current, scores on the film, like the meta score and all that stuff? Because obviously, you talked about the critics' reaction at the time.
So, okay, on Rotten Tomatoes, we got the tomato score of 84%, certified fresh by critics, 87% from audiences. The Metacritic score is an 81 from critics and an 8.8 from audiences.
And again, considering that so many horror films are in the 60s, right? I mean, this
or
is
lower, much lower.
Yes, but some of the best films are in the 60s, right? This is an incredible score. This is an incredible score, period, right, for a film. But that's interesting that again the audience responses stay the same, and if you talk to any horror scholars or filmmakers or writers, they will inevitably, especially if they are of a generation that would have experienced that firsthand or experienced the climate of that firsthand, they will cite it as one of the most inspirational and informative works that has helped shape their career.
Yeah.
So, shouldn't we then just agree with a vast number of people that this film is better than you and I think it is?
I mean, that I've never been one for just liking a film just because it has all of this like history with it. I didn't love Halloween. Halloween is another film that is apparently you have to love if you like horror because it's so inspirational, influential, all of these things. But I think that I can acknowledge that The Exorcist has truly done so much good work for the horror genre in terms of legitimization and just like helping these other filmmakers, like being like, oh, that does also scare me too. Scary. This is something I can do. Let's make something else. And it's clear that a lot of other works have been shaped by The Exorcist. However, that does not mean that I have to think that this film is that great.
So there are two things that I find myself thinking when it comes to The Exorcist in terms of my criticism of or lack of appreciation for. And one of them is that there is some preferential taste, right? And it is 100% the fault of everyone who told me that this was going to be the scariest film they've ever seen.
I think so
that,
too, yeah.
You know, like that I expected it and it was built up and it is my fault, it is their fault, it is society's fault for creating...
Blame society.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, why not? For creating something that just no film can live up to. So there's some of that. I think too, you know, I can admire, and I'm going to go with two theater works because they're the ones I always think of. I can admire Oedipus Rex, and I could admire Death of a Salesman, and I could admire that both of them do important things and that they should continue to be anthologized, but I hate them. I hate them so much. I hate everything about them, and if I never have to read them again, I've even been in Oedipus, right? I was Oedipus in Oedipus. So, like, it's not like I don't understand them. I just hate them. I just can't, they, like, bodily make me just...
Yeah,
like,
that's me with, like, classic musical theater as well. Like,
yeah.
Roger and Hammerstein, I understand they're important, but I don't like them. I don't enjoy listening to their music or watching their musicals.
And so some of it is that, you know, this is just not The Exorcist is just not my cup of tea.
Yeah.
In the same way that, you know, not all H.P. Lovecraft is my cup of tea and Stephen King is, and there are lots of people that will tell me that I'm very wrong for that, right? So some of it is just a preference thing. And that is, I think, 100% okay, but that's not worthy of a discussion, right? No. Like, at some point, that's fine.
That's just
you
us
and
being
yours.
like, we have an opinion.
Yeah, right? So what it really is, if we deconstruct it, is that I have some fundamental problems with things that are happening in terms of the narrative and things that are happening in terms of disconnect that I feel exists between the form and content of this particular film.
I think that's true, and I think that a lot of the problems come from directly from how kind of like it feels almost blasphemous to use the word muddled for this film, but I think that the film's ideas are a little muddled, and I could tell that it was going to be a little when we started watching it, because the opening thing of our film was not the first scene in the Middle East. It was actually a commentary from, was it Blatty?
I can't remember.
From either Blatty or Friedman, where they talked about the religious implications and how they actually talked about how this was either going to be the scariest film you've ever seen, or you're not going to get it, and it's all based upon if this is something that scares you.
Right.
If this is something that will keep you up at night, you're going to be more inclined or less inclined to do it. And I was like, that's a really interesting way to start out this re-release of the film, by being like, we acknowledge that some people won't like it, but that's just because you were never going to like it.
And what I find interesting about that claim is that I should have, by all accounts...
In theory, this then should have been perfect for us.
Yes, because, you know, you come with a lot of... I mean, there's a reason they have Catholic guilt as a phrase, right? I always tell people I would have made an excellent Puritan, because I just would have been like, oh yes, you're right, I should feel guilty about that, right? Like, that's just... And so this film, I think, really should have resonated with us, but I think one of my issues is that, going back to William's analysis of this film, I think what is most interesting about this film is actually what gets sort of the least attention. And that is that I don't think at the end of the day, and again, this means I'm a product of my time, I don't think that the family angle is that interesting, and I don't think that the possession of a little girl is that interesting. Maybe it's because of the fact that we never know, like, how did she get possessed? How did she get contact with this demon, right? The film doesn't answer any of this.
It's like vague answers, like... believe they try to tie it to that scene from the Middle East.
But there's no real connection between that scene and this little girl that is in any way relatable, right? It's not like, oh, you know what, if I do appropriate another person's culture, I'm in danger, right? It was just like, oh, she's possessed now. And to me...
It's a weird, also just like a weird choice. Like, I know that Williams mentioned it, like, using that to externalize the horror, but also it just kind of just demonize the Middle East.
Yes.
And being like, Middle East monstrous, it'll affect your perfect American families and girls.
And the fact that we realize that perhaps, you know, there's other things in the home that are more frightening or disturbing than this demonic presence, right? If you're reading it that way, I think you can say, well, at the very least, even though the Middle East is still sort of literally demonized, at least it's saying that we're no better, right? Or that we create an environment that allows it to prosper, right? Because the demon wasn't terrorizing somebody in that Middle East scene, right? It's only when it's in the, like, gross environment that is the American family that it can happen.
It seeps in.
But to me, what I find much more just fundamentally disturbing, in part because I'm not anticipating, you know, a family member being possessed, and if it was, I'd just kind of leave, I think, is this idea of, like, the loss of faith, right? And it is this idea of, like, what does it take to realize that your beliefs, when confronted with the fact of your belief, is still not enough. And yes, the film does try to do that, and it brings in, you know, Father Damien's mother and all this stuff, but because that takes the backseat to everything else, right? Instead of showing us a scene where a little girl is masturbating with a crucifix, if we had instead shown a scene where we saw the struggles from Father Damien a little bit more explicitly, and it's some of the stuff that gets cut out, right? It's some of the stuff that's in the director's cut that gets cut out into the theatrical version. But that's the part that I think is more horrifying.
And I think that because there are two I think we have to acknowledge there are two versions of this film: theatrical cut and the director's cut.
Yes.
The director's cut does it has a little bit more of that. It actually, the director's cut is where the famous spider like walk is in. It's actually not in the original theatrical cut, which we watched.
Yes.
And then we watched all of the scenes from the director's cut to see what we had missed.
Yes.
I was shocked. I was like, what? This iconic shot is not even in the...
Yeah. It's interesting that, again, and it goes back to this, like, weird mythos that is created, right? And I'm going to make a really... I'm going to make a claim that is going to, I think, if I haven't alienated everyone who's listening yet.
Sure.
Then I'm pretty sure I'm just going to, like, officially cross off the list everyone who listens to us. Okay.
All right.
I think that you can tell that there is going to be a fundamental issue with a film if there exists multiple versions, like the theatrical, the director's, the extended cut, that, say, films like Blade Runner also have. Because I think then what happens is we realize that, like, the text is going to be inherently muddled. Yes, I was going to use the word palimpsest because, you know, again, it's a text that is, like, enriched because there are multiple versions, right? It's a text where we have the original, and then there's been room made in the analysis or thoughts of it for these other versions. And Blade Runner does something like this. The Exorcist does something like this, where, you know, you have to see it as a multifaceted document, right? Or as, like, multiple versions of itself. Mm-hmm. But to me, the result 99% of the time is muddied.
Because there are certain scenes that just truly don't make sense in the theatrical cut.
Yes.
Like, most of the scenes with his mother are not given any real context. Yes. And so they just feel so out of place. And you're like, why are we wasting time here? Which is not something you should ever feel. And I mean, the theatrical cut is not a short film either. So, like, I don't understand why they didn't just either take those out or put in the context so that they could make sense in the film.
But I would say that the director's version does not perfectly rectify it, right?
It's
not one of those things where you're like, oh, okay, so we'll only watch the director's version. And any time you have a film where there are going to be people that are going to advocate for different versions, right? Like, there are going to be people that say the theatrical version is the version of The Exorcist, the director's cut. Same with Blade Runner, same with any of these films. Anytime you have that sort of discussion, it means that neither or none of the versions are going to be inherently fixed, right? They're not gonna offer everything that's needed, and maybe it's an issue of adaptation, right? Because the book, The Exorcist, is quite long, right? So if the movie is 2+ hours, the book would be easily, it'd be a mini series, and so maybe it's an issue of adaptation. Maybe it's an issue of preference and style. There are films that don't feel the need to make all the connections and sort of connect all the narrative threads. But I felt like this is a film that is relying on you understanding the narrative to be frightened.
Yeah, I think that's true.
It's just not doing justice to the narrative at moments when it should. And again, if you're going to create an iconic scene, right? Like, everyone knows the head spinning and the pea soup vomit. So, like, that's great that they have an iconic image, and I'm not saying they should have cut that scene, but at some point, I think there could have been places where instead of giving us the shock value, they could have given us the substance I needed.
I think I'm about to propose a big change to the film.
Excellent.
I think a lot of the problems could have been alleviated had we not even pretended that we were supposed to have, like, an emotional connection to Reagan. If we had switched the focus far more from Reagan and her mother to being from the priest's perspective, so that it was really more, so, like, they were more of just, like, you can have all the shock value, you can keep every scene there, because I believe he's present for everything that happens, because it's all about kind of haunting him more than anything else. Yes, it's the possession of her, but it's really trying to be the destruction of him. So I think you just switch the perspective more, so it's all from him. That way you can have the scenes with the mother. You can really more deeply explore this, like, in the face of this thing, which seems to be an affirmation of faith, but also you're still in denial because that's just the human condition. I think that would be a far more interesting and a far more effective film.
And see, here's where I find myself simultaneously agreeing with you and knowing that is only a solution that you and I have because we have grown up in a post-Exorcist world. Because this is the text that told us, children, they are evil, right? Like, this is the text that helped us to understand the concept of the demonic child, the concept of being frightened of something that should be, sugar and spice and everything nice. Like, what would have been frightening for the initial audience going into that would have been the fact that this is something they would have never seen before, right? You don't see films with adorable, like, really loving little girls, especially, that then become fundamentally disgusting, both emotionally, spiritually, as well as physically. Despite the fact that, like, there's some nice ways that this becomes an intriguing metaphor for, puberty and things like that. And I think those are things that, like, Head Full of Ghosts and Paul Tremblay really kind of play with later. But we say this because, again, the film has done maybe too good of a job. To us, that's not interesting because we've seen so many versions of it that may have since then been more effective, but at the very least, we're not surprised by it, right?
Exactly.
I think going into this movie in 1973 is going to have the same feeling as going into Psycho, where you're going to be like, interesting, oh, look at this lovely, oh no, right? And it's just an experience that we can never have. What are you supposed to do with that, right? Like, what are you supposed to do with a film that is so effective in producing, again, this world that you can truly say a pre and post Exorcist world, where then the text doesn't hold the same effect as a text
because it's been so influential in defining a genre. Like,
exactly. I mean, it is the first film that we've asked students to watch for a class on the home in American horror, because how can you talk about The Conjuring? How can you talk about Head Full of Ghosts? How can you talk about any sort of remotely possession-based narrative if you have not had experience with The Exorcist? It's just that there are so many issues with, for me, the fact that this tries to be a narrative film, but then has all of these holes that are needed. If you want me to care for someone, and not just the priest.
Right.
If you want me to care for Reagan and her mom, there are things I need in terms of character development that this film, in an effort to make it scary by not giving us this information, has denied us.
It just it distances you from the characters, and it gives you that weird voyeuristic thing, but not in a positive way. Like, sometimes I use that phrase in a very, like, oh yeah, it was so weird how I felt like I couldn't intervene here. But it was, in this one, it felt more like there were clear walls that were put up around these characters that we weren't allowed into.
Yes.
And that seemed like a poor choice.
Yes. And I think that the fact that the conversation almost immediately goes into gender identity, and whether or not it's okay to be a single female mother, or obviously a
there's
female
tons
mother.
of academic articles written about this film from either a feminist or a super anti-feminist perspective.
And this is where students kind of gravitate first, because again, I think that this is the like top layer, right, of investigation. But for me, it's not where I want to go, but it's also not where I feel, if you're going to do the film any justice, that you should go. Because you have to decide, and we talked about this with Halloween too, right? Is this a film that is more sort of affirmative, in that it's reestablishing the status quo and saying, you know, if only there had been a strong father figure, then it would have been okay, and no child would have been possessed? Or is this a disaffirmative film because it's saying that, you know, look, even the patriarchal system can't do anything about this because something is so broken, we'll never refer back to it.
Yeah.
But that's not where I think most people take the conversation.
I think it's just it's not about if it ultimately affirms or disaffirms the overarching society. It's usually very much like, is this film just reinforcing harmful stereotypes?
Yes.
Which, kind of, it was 1973.
Right, and so again, it's a product of its times, which we've had issue with some films that are a product of their times, just as we have issues with films that are a product of now, right, for the same reason. But it seems like the more, as the film has grown in terms of it being like the film everyone must see, the conversations that are interesting about the film have waned. And I think it's because everyone just assumes that you've already been a part of those conversations, right? Because you experienced them in the 70s and 80s and 90s or whatever.
In academia, there's like there's this thing that always gets talked about, like, you're entering a conversation that has already been had.
Yes.
And I feel like it may not be always like when you talk about this film on the same academic level as academia, but you are entering a pre-established conversation anytime you talk about The Exorcist. There has surely been someone who has talked about this before you.
Yes.
Someone who has seen it before you, and someone who has probably had very similar reactions to you before it.
And so I think what happens is that, you know, that whole claim about, you know, you're entering into a conversation is supposed to enrich what's happening. But I think that for films that have the gravitas of The Exorcist, and it, you know, we could add 2001 Space Odyssey. I mean, there's lots of films we could add to that list. I think that it's become so what else is there to say? Let's just look at what people have said and kind of end the discussion there. And so again, I find myself struggling because part of my problem with the film is not the film's fault. Part of it is.
Part of it is its fault. Part of it is it's a bit confusing. It doesn't quite know where exactly it wants the source of horror to be, which is why no character truly gets developed in the most effective way.
Right. Are we supposed to see the source of horror as the act of being possessed against one's will, the act of having your child turn into this monster, the act of losing your faith? And the film just kind of is like,
Yes, it is.
Yes. And we've talked about this, right? This is like for me, this might be the most important question one can ask as a creator of horror, and that is, what is the source of horror for you, the audience? And you should also have it for the characters, but I think
it's less important in the affect that it produces.
Yes. And I think what happened is that they said, you know, here's the source of horror for all of these characters. Pick the one that you feel best fits.
So that's what Jordan Peele was inspired by.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, and we've talked about this. We've talked about, like, that was the problem of Us. He was like, reach in the bag, pick your
source of horror.
Yes. And I'm not sure that works.
And I think that leads to the problems of, is this film affirmative or disaffirmative? Yes. It is. Yes, it's both of them.
And I think that leads to the problem of that sense of feeling distanced in this voyeuristic act, because instead of it being, oh my gosh, here's my fear, it's being shared by this character. It's, oh yeah, I guess that's something that I'm afraid of. Let's see how it plays out.
Yeah.
And I just think that that's something that, for me, in my reading of the film, and other people may feel like they can identify clearly that source of horror, but for me, that's what's missing, right? Is that I don't have that one clear thing that I can say, this is what I'm supposed to be terrified of. Good, because now I am. And there have been times that I've watched a film and realized I have a fear I didn't know I had. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to be something that, like, I've been struggling with. I can just be like, oh, I didn't know I needed to be afraid of this.
But now
Thank you for that so very much.
Thanks, film or text.
Yeah, like, and Martyrs, I think, is a good example. I didn't know I needed to be afraid of some of those issues, but now I know that I need to be afraid of this concept of transcendence and what it means,
Yeah.
But that had a very clear source of horror that was different from what the characters were experiencing. Mm-hmm. And so I think if that is my biggest, and it will probably always be for everything, my biggest problem with the text, independent of just living in a post-Exorcist world. So I think I mentioned this earlier, right? That there are films you cannot watch without having seen The Exorcist.
Exactly.
And I think that...
It feels like you're setting something up
I am.
now.
Thank you so much. This is my transitional sentence.
Oh, very good.
So
I like where it's going.
Thank you. With that in mind, it seems like a perfect choice would be...
2013's The Conjuring, which we actually briefly referenced here as one of the texts that you can see clear links from The Exorcist to the film itself.
Yes. And this is, I think, a good way to continue our discussion of films that have begun to sort of create a mythology that goes beyond the text. And in this case, it's much like The Exorcist in a literal way, in that there's, films within this universe.
Exactly.
But also just sort of the idea that,
It's very much like a spiritual successor in almost all aspects to The Exorcist itself, as we will undoubtedly get into. The franchise, the continued legitimization of this genre, the box office success, it's a lot of parallels we'll draw.
Yes. And so we hope that you will join us for our next episode on The Conjuring. In the meantime,
be sure to share us with your friends, subscribe.
And if there's films or books that you would like for us to look at, please let us know, because will be more than happy to add them to our list.
You can get in contact with us via our social media, which is in the description of this podcast, as well as our email, which is also in the description of this podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.